We turn now then to the actual launch of the report itself. And for that, I'd like to hand over to Peter Sweatman, founder and CEO of ClimateStrategy and Partners. He's one of the world's foremost experts on financing and energy efficiency, has spent 30 years in finance, the last nearly 20 of those specifically on energy efficiency and climate finance. He also headed up the G20's task group on energy efficiency investments for 5 years, and is a rapporteur for the European Commission and UNEP Finance Initiatives, Energy Efficiency Financial Institutions Group. I couldn't think of anyone more qualified to have led this work, and I think we're all looking forward to hear exactly what you've done and how it can change things going forward.
Thank you so much, Sonia, for that very kind introduction. Thank you for moderating today, and thank you also to Adriana and Mauricio, who are behind the stages here from my team in Madrid to help produce this event. Thank you, Renee from ECF, for your funding, and thank you, Adrian, who I've known even before the beginning of the Renovate Europe campaign's launch, which I was privileged to have spoken at. Thank you for your 10 years of constant reminder of just how urgent action on energy efficiency in Europe's buildings is. So this Tuesday was a bank holiday in Madrid, and so I predictably spent the day listening to Vice President Al Gore, who was hosting an event called Finance at Countdown that was broadcast by TEDx from Edinburgh. One by one, Christine Lagarde, Janet Yellen, Kristalina Georgieva, Mark Carney, Lord Stern, David Blood, and many of the world's leading financiers described how COP26 will bring together the world's biggest banks, asset owners, asset managers, and insurers in a net zero financial alliance. Each described their contributions of how to address financed emissions and how to accelerate the decarbonization of finance in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. Now, I don't think I heard mortgage portfolio standards, but I may be wrong. But I'm going to tell you in the next 15 minutes why next time they meet, hopefully they will. So in these minutes, I'll tell you why we need to work with banks on buildings. I'll then say what a mortgage portfolio standard is, and then I'll suggest what might be done with that knowledge. So, why banks? Well, buildings are the most valuable and important store of value on Earth, aside perhaps from nature itself. There are $280 trillion of buildings that are built. That represents half of all global savings, and those buildings are used in collateral for around a third of all loans to companies. In energy and climate terms, buildings are the Achilles heel of the EU's Green Deal. They use 40% of our energy and emit 36% of greenhouse gases. 2/3 of them were built before standards even considered energy performance, and most of those will need to be renovated before 2050. The EU institutions know this, and in October of last year, they launched an EU Renovation Wave strategy. This wave is to renovate 35 million buildings by 2030, and will require 275 billion euros of investment in that activity annually. Further, that strategy talks to the need for mandatory minimum energy performance standards across all building sectors, which I support and I heard Adrian mention in his opening remarks. Now, what I'm not so sure about is how these 35 million buildings owners discover that they are in the EU's wave, and how they get the money to start to surf it. Enter the 50 million existing homeowners and mortgage customers of banks. Mortgage lenders are huge aggregators. They finance tens of millions of homes. They are a uniform entry point into millions of conversations, and they already have hundreds of checklists and operational processes which deal with things much more complex than home renovations. Furthermore, in light of their need to identify climate transition risks, to green their lending activity to align with the EU taxonomy, and keep one step ahead of minimum energy performance standards, they need to address their mortgage books. So, where are we now? 10 years ago, I helped launch a home renovation initiative that used thermal imaging to see what they called heat bleed. Heat bleed was the code red for buildings used to inspire innovation using local contractors to save wasted energy and wasted income. We don't need a thermal camera to see the red G-label energy performance on this chart of energy performance certificate labels across Europe. By 2050, all the red, orange, and yellow on the left chart must be green, and banks with a mortgage portfolio distribution, shown as an example on the right, must green all of those homes. Seeing all this red, what would Arnold Schwarzenegger say? Don't get angry, get even. So, what is a mortgage portfolio standard? Mortgage portfolio standard is a regulatory mechanism where banks pledge to work with their clients to increase the energy performance of the buildings which back their mortgages along a science-based trajectory for their whole portfolio. The EU first introduced mandatory CO2 standards for passenger cars in 2009. Mortgage portfolio standards are like fleet emission standards. The latest batch of fleet emission standards from 2019 are expected to reduce transport emissions by a third by 2030, to save car owners thousands of euros in fuel costs each year and create tens of thousands of new jobs. But Europe did not invent fleet emission standards. Emission standards for light-duty vehicles were defined as a result of the Clean Air Act in the United States in 1990, and they have been used there to success ever since. In fact, they worked so well that when the states wanted to grow renewables, the Renewable Portfolio Standard was applied to utilities in the United States from 1999. RPS were directly responsible for the building of 82 gigawatts of renewable generation in the States, which is about half of all the renewables that has been built there. An example would be the Renewable Portfolio Standard in Maine now is set at 80% by 2030 and will be 100% renewables by 2050. Now, Europe doesn't have an RPS for utilities, but we do have energy efficiency obligation schemes in what was Article 7 of the Energy Efficiency Directive of 2012, of which we'll talk more later. So, what's more, some banks already have a voluntary mortgage portfolio standard. Concretely, ABN AMRO, who have loans worth 150 billion euros against commercial and residential property, which is some 2/3 of their balance sheet, has an MPS target of Energy Performance Certificate Level A average by 2030. ABN has partnered with PCAF to see what needs to be done and in each building, and it uses the IEA's Beyond 2 Degrees scenario to determine its MPS trajectory. In February this year, the UK went to consult on a voluntary mortgage portfolio standard, which would set an average EPC band C by 2030 for all UK mortgage lenders. BEIS launched this drive after proposing mandatory energy performance disclosure for mortgages, with a breakdown of banks' mortgage portfolios' energy performance in percentage terms required. Clearly, therefore, the UK sees lenders as allies to help improving home energy performance and hopes that they will also promote a new trust mark to ensure the high quality works in new renovations. As simple as the MPS concept is, there are 5 design elements that I think are worth highlighting. The first is all mortgage lenders are regulated parties. So that means whether they are banks, funds, or other vehicles. 2, the entire mortgage portfolio needs to be net zero emissions by 2050, and there must be interim targets every 5 years. MPS interim targets must fit into a Paris Agreement aligned pathway for the territory in which the buildings are. Real energy performance data is preferred, but energy performance certificates are a useful interim proxy, and there should be penalties for non-compliance. So when hearing this, some people have asked me, well, are MPS fair or unfair? Wouldn't banks just sell the low energy performing mortgages to avoid to have to work with customers? I think the answer to that question, or how compliance would work in banks, is each lender could choose between 2 compliance routes. The first is what we'd call the customer renovation route. This would involve picking the worst performing homes, energetically speaking, and upgrading them, because the further you can move the dial on G's to A's to as high a performance as possible would deliver the greatest average portfolio performance. Or number 2, they could go the trading route and sell loans backed by low EPC properties. One of the benefits of regulating all mortgage lenders operating in the EU together is answering the question, who would buy the low energy performing properties, as everyone shares the same problem. A quick discount would appear to apply, therefore, to low energy performing mortgages, and a premium might appear for high energy performing mortgage collateral. This would not impact borrowers because the terms under which their mortgage is met would not change, but it will increase the economic benefits to banks who are successful in converting mortgages through renovation. This, I argue, creates a virtuous circle. So given that, what now? What is the art of the practical in EU regulatory terms? So the good news is that we are indeed on time, as you heard from Adrian. There are 9 relevant pieces of EU legislation or files open at present, which some of the most important ones are the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, due to be published as a part of the Fit for 55 regulatory package on the 14th of December of this year, and the Mortgage Credit Directive. Article 10 of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive deals with financial incentives and market barriers. I argue that a new bullet point can simply be added. So Article 10.8 could say, member states shall require all mortgage lenders to implement mortgage portfolio standards to align the energy and emissions performance of their financed buildings portfolio with the Paris Agreement. The 2014 Mortgage Credit Directive establishes common rules in the residential mortgage market to better inform customers about the real costs of a mortgage, to enable customers to better compare between competitors, and to reflect on the mortgage contract before contract closure. It needs upgrade and alignment in the context of the EU's Green Deal, and to consider physical, climate and energy transition risks and opportunities, which in 2014 were not as material nor proximate as they are today. I believe that Mortgage Credit Directive can include a duty to inform borrowers of any climate or transition risks which may face the property, including an updated energy performance certificate as a required component of the European Standard Information Sheet called ISIS. called, sorry, ESIS, I should say. That's perhaps a bad mistake, ESIS. Further, Article 14 could include a duty of advice, and that would require engagement on potential deep renovation options to allow customers to compare these costs and reflect upon this information at the key trigger point, getting a mortgage in that mortgage cycle. Finally, MPS are indeed compatible with climate mitigation thresholds that have been published in the EU's Taxonomy's Delegated Act. And they will help support increase banks' green asset ratios, which the European Banking Authority is considering to assess taxonomy relevant and aligned lending ratios and support improved climate risk assessments of the future, as indeed also is indicated in the ECB's latest strategy. So, to close, there are 4 key takeaways from this report, and I will place a link to the full report in the chat. The first, mortgage portfolio standards will align mortgage lenders with the EU Green Deal and the Renovation Wave strategy. An MPS can address 50 million home owners immediately. MPS will accelerate financed offers to the low-hanging fruit for energy-efficient renovations, and it is a structured way for banks to manage climate transition risks in their mortgage portfolios. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Peter, for I think a very clear and nonetheless concise but comprehensive introduction to the work you've undertaken. Does anyone have any immediate questions to Peter? He will join us on the panel as well, so if you need a little more time to digest, that's understandable. I don't think I've seen anything come in via the chat. Maybe before we hear from the European Commission and the panel, you've obviously been speaking to people about this, Peter. So one question would be, I mean, how enthusiastic are different stakeholders in general terms about this? Or if you like, what's the main question that's been thrown back at you when you come with this idea? What do people ask?
So first of all, I think I very much think that people welcome new thinking. I mean, the thing that I've most been greeted with when talking about a mortgage portfolio standard, apart from the name, which tends to perhaps sound too technical and maybe shy people away, even though, funnily enough, portfolio standards, as I've illustrated, have been used quite frequently in the regulatory sphere, is the question, does this solve all of the problems in renovation? And it doesn't. But I do think it solves one of the enormous glaring problems, which is how on earth will we renovate 35 million homes by 2030? So we really have a very limited audience of entities that are capable of contributing to millions of home renovations a year. And so I think at the moment, in the supply chain to renovations, we have to have, like we do, I mean, it wasn't really in the utilities sort of mandate to save energy on behalf of their customers. It wasn't necessarily in the light goods and the light vehicle manufacturers mandate at the time to save emissions and greenhouse gases. However, over time and with the right regulatory tools, those organizations have been aligned and now support indeed many of the regulatory processes and approaches that have worked for them and for society. And I think this is another one of those. So I think there's a little bit of sticker shock, perhaps when I first talk about this idea, but then as it sinks in, there's been a real sense of engagement.
Okay, so a bit of surprise initially, and then why didn't we think of this sooner type response. Okay, thank you very much. I propose we move on, and indeed, as I said, Peter will be around to answer any other questions you may have as we get going. So